He's been called the last of a certain kind of American leading man, the one who doesn't need to shout to command a room, the one who can turn a pause into a confession and a stare into a whole backstory. But there's a point, somewhere past 70, when even that kind of steadiness starts to look less like strength and more like survival. Kevin Costner was born January 18th, 1955, in Linwood, California, and the arc of his life has always carried the same contradiction. The world sees a man who endures, while the man himself keeps paying for endurance with pieces of home he never gets to buy back. In the past few years, the public story has narrowed into headlines and numbers, and that's part of what makes it so brutal, because the math is easy to repeat and the human cost is harder to sit with. His marriage to Christine Baumgartner unraveled publicly after she filed for divorce in 2023, and what followed was not just a private separation, but a legal and media storm that turned family life into court calendars and monthly figures. With a judge ultimately setting child support at about $63,000 per month after earlier, larger requests were reported. Those numbers travel fast because numbers always do, but what doesn't travel is the quiet image behind them. 3 children living between 2 households, routines split, holidays renegotiated, the kind of absence that doesn't announce itself as tragedy until you're living inside it. He once played men who protected people for a living, bodyguards and lawmen, and patriarchs who could hold the line through chaos. In real life, the line he keeps trying to hold is simpler and more painful. Showing up consistently when the house you built is no longer yours to return to in the same way. And then there is the other gamble, the one that tells you what kind of person Costner still is when the safest move would be to stop risking anything. Horizon, an American saga, was not a studio assignment. It was a long obsession, a decades-carried idea that he pushed into reality with a level of commitment that looks almost reckless in modern Hollywood. Chapter MOT opened in theaters in 2024, and by most measurable standards, it did not recoup its reported production cost, which meant the story instantly turned from art into an autopsy, from vision into verdict. If you want a clean headline, that's the one. A legendary filmmaker bankrolls a dream, and the box office doesn't reward him. But the more unsettling version is what that implies about his inner life. He's still choosing faith over safety at an age when most people are trying to reduce risk, not increase it. That's not just ambition. That's a psychological habit formed long before fame. The same habit that can build masterpieces and also quietly hollow out a person if they never learn how to rest. His career has always been defined by endurance, and endurance has a shadow side that rarely gets discussed. The belief that if you keep moving, you can outrun loss. Yet loss keeps finding him anyway, in different forms at different speeds. The public has watched him be celebrated, mocked, re-celebrated, and questioned again, and even now his Yellowstone-era resurgence has been described in terms of big viewership and massive per-episode pay, the kind of late-career validation that should feel like a victory lap. But what happens when the world finally looks at you again and you realize being seen doesn't fix what's broken? It only adds weight to the parts you were already carrying. In 2025, another headline surfaced that hinted at how quickly a passion project can turn into a battlefield. A stunt performer filed a lawsuit tied to Horizon's production, with Costner denying the allegations through his attorney, and regardless of where the legal truth ultimately lands. The existence of that dispute reinforces the same theme running through his life story, that the things he builds attract storms, and storms leave residue. So when people frame this as the tragedy of a man beyond heartbreaking, the real question is not whether he has money, awards, or a legacy carved into film history, because he does. The question is what it costs to keep being the person who carries everything without collapsing in public. Because there is a specific kind of heartbreak in realizing that applause cannot warm an empty kitchen, that a creative calling can be both a sanctuary and a wedge, and that the older you get, the less time you have to repair what ambition quietly damaged. And if you listen closely to the way his recent story reads, it doesn't sound like scandal as much as it sounds like a man confronting the limit of endurance itself. You can outlast rejection, you can outlast ridicule, You can even outlast failure, but you cannot outlast time. And time is the one opponent that never gets tired. If part MOT is about the cost of endurance in the present, then part high has to go backward to where that endurance was forged. Because Kevin Costner did not wake up famous, wealthy, or emotionally armored. He was shaped long before Hollywood learned how to pronounce his name. Inside a childhood where security was fragile and permanence was an illusion. Born into a working-class family in Linwood, California, he was the youngest son of William Costner, a man who dug ditches, climbed power lines, and came home each night carrying the physical proof of labor in his hands, and Sharon Costner, a social worker who carried a different kind of weight home, the quiet residue of other people's pain. Their house was not defined by luxury or certainty. It was defined by effort. Bills were paid, food appeared on the table, but comfort was never guaranteed. What was guaranteed was movement. Kevin's family moved constantly. Compton, Ventura, Visalia, Orange County. Each relocation sealing one version of childhood into cardboard boxes and reopening it somewhere unfamiliar. By the time most children are learning how to settle, he was already learning how to detach. But before the moving, before the restlessness became routine, there was a loss that settled into the family like a permanent weather system. 2 years before Kevin was born, his brother Mark Douglas Costner lived for only a single day. The grief that followed did not explode. It compressed. It rearranged the emotional furniture of the house in silence. His parents did not speak of it often, but everything revolved around it. Love became vigilant. Protection sharpened. His father grew more rigid, guarding his remaining sons from a world he no longer trusted. His mother grew quieter, folding tenderness into small gestures and long pauses. Kevin absorbed all of it without explanation. And that is where one of the most important lessons of his life took root. Pain does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it teaches by never raising its voice at all. That kind of environment does something particular to a child. It doesn't create rebellion. It creates watchfulness. Kevin became the quiet one, the observer, the boy teachers overlooked because he wasn't disruptive or demanding. He filled margins with poems instead of answers, learned to keep his thoughts close, learned that attachment carried risk because anything familiar could disappear without warning. Home was not a place. It was something provisional, something you packed and unpacked. That sense of impermanence would later become the emotional engine of his work. But at the time, it was simply survival. You learn how to move forward without complaint. You learn how to say goodbye without ceremony. You learn how to endure. By his teenage years, he had grown tall, but the more important growth was internal. Church choirs became a refuge where his voice shook with longing rather than confidence. Writing became a private language for emotions that had nowhere else to go. And somewhere inside him, a hunger formed for wide, open land, for spaces that would not vanish overnight, for places where stillness felt earned rather than temporary. That hunger is not an accident. It is the psychological opposite of constant displacement. When you grow up moving, you crave roots that cannot be boxed. At 23, newly married and armed with a sensible degree in marketing and finance, Kevin did exactly what a responsible son from that background is expected to do. He chose certainty. He put on a shirt, showed up on time, collected the paycheck, and disappeared into an office routine that promised stability. From the outside, it looked like success. From the inside, it felt like suffocation. The job did not threaten him. That was the problem. It slowly erased him. Numbers paid rent, but stories were where his breath lived. Each day at the desk compressed something inside his chest, the quiet knowledge that safety, when chosen at the expense of truth, eventually becomes its own form of danger. The turning point did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived on an airplane. Fresh from his honeymoon, Kevin found himself seated beside Richard Burton, a man whose life embodied everything Kevin had not yet dared to pursue. Nervous, respectful, and honest, he admitted a truth he had buried for years. He wanted to act, but fear had taught him how to stay still. Burton did not lecture him. He listened. Then he offered a sentence that functioned less like advice and more like permission. We share the same eyes. I think you'll be all right. When the plane landed, the symbolism could not have been clearer. Burton stepped into a waiting limousine. Kevin joined the line for the bus. Two lives separated by proximity, courage, and timing. As Burton drove away, he leaned out and said, almost casually, "Good luck." Those words mattered because they arrived without obligation. They did not promise success. They simply acknowledged possibility. Within weeks, Kevin resigned from his job. There was no applause, no safety net, no guarantee. Just a single suitcase, a second-hand jacket, a worn car, and a decision that terrified him precisely because it was honest. What followed dismantled every illusion. Hunger, cold apartments, pride that refused to let him call home. He scrubbed boats until his hands cracked, drove delivery trucks through endless nights, guided bus tours past other people's dreams while quietly measuring the distance to his own. Rejection became routine. Silence became familiar. He learned how to wait, how to walk miles to save bus fare, how to leave photos at casting offices where eyes were already elsewhere. For 6 years, nothing happened. Not dramatically, just steadily. Auditions ended in silence. Doors closed politely. And then came the big chill, the moment that was supposed to change everything. He had a role. He did the work. He sat alone at the premiere, waiting to see proof that the suffering had meaning. The credits rolled. His name never appeared. That moment forces a man to confront a brutal question. How long can you remain invisible before you forget the sound of your own name? Kevin didn't leave early. He watched every second. Then he walked out into the night and went back to class. That choice tells you everything about who he was becoming. Dreams don't open doors. They teach you how to keep knocking. And endurance, once learned, does not turn off easily. It follows you forward, shaping every success, every relationship, every risk you take later, including the ones that would eventually cost him far more than he ever expected. When Kevin Costner finally broke through, it didn't feel like arrival. It felt like exposure. After years of invisibility, being seen did not come with relief. It came with weight. Silverado in 1985 was the first crack in the wall, the moment Hollywood noticed the man who had trained in silence. He didn't burst onto the screen with bravado. He stood there, steady, contained, carrying something unresolved in his posture. That was the difference. Audiences sensed it even if they couldn't name it. He looked like someone who had waited, and waiting leaves marks. Then came the untouchables. The role hardened his image into something mythic: resolve, restraint, moral gravity. He wasn't flashy. He didn't choose scenery. He anchored it. Success followed quickly, but not gently. Bull Durham gave him charm without noise. Field of Dreams did something rarer. It lodged him inside memory. When he whispered, "If you build it, he will come," it didn't sound like a line. It sounded like a confession. People leaned toward him in dark theaters, not because he was loud, but because he trusted silence. And silence, when handled honestly, can feel like truth. By his mid-30s, Costner's career stopped being about ambition and became about necessity. He wasn't choosing projects to rise anymore. He was choosing them to breathe. That distinction matters, because when creation becomes oxygen, you stop asking whether the cost is reasonable. You only ask whether stopping would kill something inside you. That's how Dances with Wolves was born, not as a career move, but as an act of faith bordering on defiance. A 3-hour Western. Subtitles. Long silences. Executives urged him to cut, to speed it up, to explain more. Costner refused. He insisted the quiet was the point. The gamble nearly crushed him. Storms destroyed sets. Budgets swelled. Actors walked away. Nights stretched into frozen doubt inside trailers where fear paced without rest. Later, he would describe those months not as courage, but as fear endured minute by minute. When the film finally reached audiences, something unexpected happened. It didn't just succeed. It shifted the industry's center of gravity. Awards followed. Money followed. Validation thundered through rooms built for it. But inside Costner, something more complicated surfaced. Triumph did not silence the old hush. It sharpened it. Because success doesn't erase insecurity, it gives it a larger stage. Standing ovations feel different when you've spent years unheard. Applause doesn't land softly. It crashes. And the louder it gets, the more pressure builds to never disappoint again. From that point forward, momentum ruled his life. Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, soared financially even as critics mocked his accent. He smiled through it, because mockery feels survivable when you've lived through erasure. Then JFK demanded conviction beyond performance, pulling him into cultural arguments that blurred art and truth. And then the Bodyguard. The decision to wait for Whitney Houston wasn't strategic. It was instinctual. He believed in her before certainty arrived. The film became a cultural event, the soundtrack a global artifact. Numbers exploded. His name turned into a brand. And brands are dangerous things. Brands don't rest. Brands don't doubt. Brands don't need kitchens or mornings or ordinary nights. Brands perform endurance endlessly. But Costner was still a man with children, a man with a marriage already stretched thin by absence. The work that made him untouchable demanded everything else. He directed by day, edited by night, lived in motion. Friends worried about his sleep. He brushed it off. Winning, he admitted once, can feel heavier than losing. Because when you're losing, expectations fall away. When you're winning, they multiply. The strain showed itself publicly during Waterworld. Hurricanes tore through sets. Costs ballooned. Danger became real. Headlines sharpened into ridicule. The industry that once praised his ambition now framed it as excess. Then came The Postman, a project driven by belief that collapsed under its own weight. Awards turned into jokes. The same hands that once held Oscars now felt the tremor of doubt. This is where many careers end, not with one failure, but with a narrative turning against you. Hollywood does not punish mistakes. It punishes persistence after mistakes. Costner didn't disappear. He did something quieter. He returned to westerns, to smaller stories, to projects fewer people believed in. Beginning again never scared him. He had been beginning again since childhood. But the world's attention thinned. Phones rang less. Rooms that once leaned toward him learned how to look through him. The papers called him dated. A relic. Vanity. He didn't respond. "You don't chase every lie," he said once. "You survive long enough for them to tire." Still, silence hits differently when it follows applause. Years passed like this, working, rebuilding, enduring. Then, unexpectedly, Yellowstone arrived. At 63, Costner stepped into John Dutton, a man defined not by dominance, but by fatigue, duty, and the burden of holding ground that keeps slipping away. The role resonated because it wasn't aspirational. It was honest. America recognized itself in a man trying to protect something while knowing the cost might be unbearable. The show became massive. Viewership soared. His per-episode pay made headlines. But the real return wasn't money. It was alignment. For the first time in years, his interior life and his work spoke the same language. Even then, he didn't slow down. The old dream resurfaced. Horizon, an American saga he had carried since the late 1980s. Studios said it was too long, too expensive, too quiet. Costner didn't argue. He financed it himself, mortgaged, invested tens of millions. If it failed, he said calmly, it would carry his name. That line reveals everything. He has always been willing to sign his name to belief. On set, exhausted, standing beside the camera as the sun bled into desert horizon. He wasn't chasing perfection. He was keeping faith. When the film premiered, opinion split. Box office numbers disappointed. Commentators rushed to pronounce verdicts. But Costner's expression told a different story. Approval had never been the point. Completion was. The tragedy here isn't financial. It's existential. Because when a man builds his life around endurance, he often doesn't notice how much of himself he's spending until there's very little left to cushion the fall. And that fall, quietly, had already begun somewhere else. Not on screen, at home. While he was building horizons for cinema, His personal world was learning how to fracture along familiar lines. Absence, exhaustion, competing loyalties. The same endurance that saved his career would soon test his private life again. And this time, the cost would not be measured in reviews or box office totals, but in rooms that stayed quiet after the lights went out. The deepest fractures in Kevin Costner's life were never loud. They didn't arrive as scandals or explosions. They arrived as absences that accumulated quietly until love itself grew tired of waiting. Long before the headlines learned how to summarize his marriages in numbers and settlements, there was a private erosion happening behind closed doors. His first marriage, to Cindy Silva, began before fame, before money, before the world had expectations of him. That matters, because relationships formed before success are built on belief, not proof. Cindy believed in him when belief was still an act of imagination. She waited through empty auditions, thin paychecks, and long days that ended without recognition. Their early life together was modest, improvised, held together by hope and youth's reckless confidence that love would stretch to fit whatever came next. Then success came faster than either of them could adapt to. Each film carried him farther from home, not emotionally at first, but geographically. Airports replaced kitchens. Hotel rooms replaced routines. He still loved her. He still loved their children. But love does not survive on intention alone. It survives on presence. And presence was the one thing his career demanded he give away. Cindy became the center of gravity for a family that now revolved around someone who was rarely still. She raised 3 children while reading about her husband in magazines, watching him become an image while she stayed anchored in the unglamorous labor of real life. The imbalance was not cruelty. It was momentum, and momentum is indifferent to intimacy. Trust and shatter all at once. It thinned. Missed birthdays blurred into missed holidays. Promises were broken not through betrayal, but through exhaustion. They tried to slow it down. Counseling. Pauses between projects. Quiet cabins meant to reset the rhythm of a marriage that had lost its tempo. But distance had already learned their habits. Silence filled spaces where conversation used to live. And when silence settles long enough, it begins to feel permanent. By the time their marriage ended in 1994, there was no fire left to burn. Only fatigue. Their divorce became public math almost immediately, discussed as one of the costliest of its time. But the true cost was never financial. It was structural. One home became 2. One daily rhythm split into alternating weeks and careful schedules. He once admitted the hardest realization wasn't losing the marriage, but understanding he would now see his children only half as much. That is a sentence no amount of success can soften. The night papers were signed. They shared a final meal. No accusations. No raised voices. Just 2 people reaching for the same glass out of habit, then stopping. Outside, cameras waited. Inside, everything went quiet. After the divorce, Costner did what he had always done when life became unbearable. He worked. Motion became anesthesia. Film stacked on films. Travel filled empty space. Yet the absence followed him everywhere. Fame could be rebuilt. Family time could not. And even as his career continued, a different hunger began to surface. Less about achievement, more about repair. That's when Bridget Rooney entered his life briefly. The relationship was not designed to last, and it didn't. But it produced something that altered him permanently, a son. When questions arose, he did not hide. He accepted responsibility immediately. Support was provided. Presence was promised. He made a quiet vow that his child would never grow up wondering if he mattered. That vow was not a public statement. It was a private correction, an attempt to interrupt a cycle of absence he understood too well. Then came what looked, for a long time, like redemption. Christine Baumgartner arrived not as a whirlwind, but as calm. Younger, composed, steady. Their relationship developed slowly, cautiously, shaped by the lessons of his past failures. When they married in 2004, it did not feel like a Hollywood spectacle. It felt like a rival. For nearly 2 decades, they built a life that finally seemed balanced. 3 children, a ranch that offered stillness instead of schedules, mornings that didn't begin with departures. He took fewer roles. He stayed home longer. The work became selective. Horizon wasn't just a film project. It was a legacy gesture, something meant to be handed down, not chased for approval. For a while, the balance held. But time applies pressure even to careful constructions. Yellowstone demanded long stretches away. Horizon demanded money, attention, and total immersion. Slowly, work crept back into spaces love once occupied. Christine wanted presence. Kevin offered provision. Neither was wrong, but they were no longer speaking the same language. Missed mornings became routine. Glances lingered without resolution. The house remained full, yet something essential went unspoken. Love doesn't always collapse dramatically. Sometimes it erodes, grain by grain, until one day the structure gives way and no one can remember exactly when the damage began. In May 2023, Christine filed for divorce. Kevin was working when the papers arrived. Scripts in hand. A life divided again. This time, the separation unfolded under relentless public scrutiny. Court filings became content. Child support requests were debated like box office returns. Prenuptial clauses were enforced with precision. But none of that language captured the smallest, most painful loss. Children waking up in different houses, learning how to divide affection across calendars. Under the agreement, Christine left the family home. A place filled with first steps and familiar echoes became something to move out of. Kevin returned to rooms that smelled faintly of absence and learned a truth that only repetition teaches. Silence has weight. Then came the photographs. Christine walking with a man Kevin had once trusted, someone inside the family circle. Proof of nothing. Pain of everything. Betrayal does not require confirmation to wound. Sometimes it lives entirely in what you can no longer unsee. For the second time in his life, Costner watched a world he had built by hand split apart. This time, not measured in wealth, but in weekends, bedrooms, and the sound of his children's laughter divided between homes. By early 2024, the marriage was legally over. The ache was not. He kept working through it, directing through wreckage, finishing Horizon while his personal horizon collapsed behind the camera. Late nights alone in trailers. Phone messages replayed longer than necessary. Ordinary questions from his children, followed by quiet after the call ended. That quiet is where tragedy lives. Not in drama, but in the new normal. The rolling suitcase. The light left on. The knowledge that some things cannot be rebuilt, only carried. And yet, he carries them. He shows up. He attends school events. He keeps promises without cameras. Because love, when it survives collapse, does not remain romance. It becomes duty, then memory, then grace. If the earlier chapters of Kevin Costner's life were defined by ambition and endurance, this stage was defined by reckoning. Not the kind that arrives with a single catastrophic moment, but the slow accounting that happens when you finally stop running long enough to feel what has been chasing you. After the collapse of his second marriage, silence became a companion he never invited, but slowly learned to recognize. Work still filled his days, but it no longer drowned out the questions that surfaced in the quiet hours. The noise of success had faded before. This time it was different. This time, the absence felt permanent. He did not retreat from responsibility. If anything, he leaned harder into it. Co-parenting became a discipline rather than a slogan. Schedules were honored. School plays mattered more than premieres. Birthdays were treated as fixed points in a life that had once been entirely negotiable. Friends noticed a change. He spoke less about the future and more about presence. Less about what he was building and more about what he was trying not to lose. For a man whose identity had been forged in motion, learning to stay still was not natural. It was practiced imperfectly and often at personal cost. At the same time, the world continued to test him. Horizon, the project he had risked so much to make, did not return what he spent in any conventional sense. Critics argued over its pacing and ambition. Commentators questioned his judgment. Numbers circulated faster than nuance ever could. But beneath the debate was a quieter truth. This was not a business miscalculation so much as a statement of belief. Costner had never chased trends. He chased continuity. He believed certain stories deserved patience, even if patience no longer paid dividends. And that belief, admirable as it is, came with consequences he was now absorbing in real time. Then there was the weight of memory. Loss does not remain static as you age. It accumulates. The death of Whitney Houston years earlier resurfaced in unexpected ways, not as spectacle, but as a reminder of limits. He had been steady for her when the world doubted. He had stood at her funeral and spoken with restraint rather than performance. Over time, that moment hardened into a lesson he carried quietly. Some people are not meant to be saved by love, and some promises exist only to shape who we are brave enough to be when we make them. He did not speak of her often. When her song came on the radio, he sometimes turned it down, not to forget, but to keep the memory intact. Grief, like love, can be damaged by overexposure. Physically, time began asserting itself more aggressively. Injuries that once healed without ceremony now lingered. Mornings became negotiations with joints and muscles that had absorbed decades of insistence. He did not complain publicly. Pain, for him, was not an enemy. It was evidence. Evidence that he had shown up, that he had not protected himself from the work. On set, crew members noticed the difference. He moved more carefully, but he did not move less. He worked longer hours than men half his age, directing, acting, editing, refusing comfort because comfort felt too much like surrender. In Aspen, where winters stripped the world down to essentials, he spent long hours alone. Hiking trails became places of quiet conversation with himself. Snow erased footprints quickly there, a visual reminder of impermanence he found strangely calming. For the first time in years, he was not asking why the world had turned away or whether he could win it back. He was asking something more difficult. Why approval had ever mattered so much. The answer was not flattering, but it was honest. Approval had been a substitute for stability. Applause had filled spaces where certainty never lived. Letting go of that dependency felt like grief, even as it felt necessary. He began writing again in those quiet months, not for an audience, but to remember what truth felt like in his hands. From that stillness came work that was more restrained, more patient, less concerned with immediate response. Success, he realized, teaches you how to rise. The long fall teaches you who you are when no one is counting. And for the first time, he allowed himself to exist outside the constant measurement of relevance. Money, once a scoreboard, shifted meaning. Years of settlements, investments, and creative risks had thinned the illusion of excess. Wealth no longer represented victory. It represented proof of survival. Proof that he had endured decades of volatility without disappearing. His properties reflected that shift. Ranches built for weather and time rather than display. Homes designed around family life, not image. Vehicles chosen for terrain and function. Nothing ornamental. Everything used. Friends described spaces filled with tools, dust, and evidence of work. He was not curating a lifestyle. He was maintaining one. What remained constant was his commitment to his children. Different homes, different routines, different chapters of his life. He treated none of it as complication. He treated it as obligation. Calls were returned. Visits happened without announcement. Milestones were marked quietly. He did not turn his children into symbols or talking points. He let them have privacy, even when privacy cost him narrative control. In an era that rewards exposure, that choice mattered. As he entered his 70s, Costner's life no longer resembled the myth people attached to his name. It looked narrower, more deliberate, less forgiving of distraction. The tragedy was no longer a single event. It was cumulative. A life spent outrunning silence finally slowed enough to hear it. And what the silence said was simple and unyielding. Endurance alone is not enough. You can survive nearly anything, but survival does not guarantee wholeness. Yet there was something quietly admirable in the way he carried that knowledge. He did not become bitter. He did not retreat into nostalgia. He continued working, continued showing up, continued choosing integrity even when it cost comfort. If earlier chapters were about proving himself to the world, this one was about remaining answerable to the people and principles that existed before the world was watching. And that is where the heartbreak deepens. Not because he failed, but because he learned, too late, what success cannot replace. Time, presence, the ordinary days that build a life and then vanish without record. He cannot reclaim them. He can only honor them by how he lives now. By the time Kevin Costner reached his 70s, the reckoning was no longer theoretical. It lived in his body. It announced itself each morning before memory had fully arrived, in stiffness that did not fade quickly and aches that no longer asked permission. Tom, once an abstract opponent, had become intimate. The world still saw the cowboy, the sheriff, the unflinching patriarch. What it did not see was the man negotiating with his own spine before sunrise, stretching carefully, wrapping joints, learning how to move again each day without surrendering dignity. He did not endure pain for pride. He endured it for honesty. Every major role he had chosen demanded physical truth. Waterworld burned his skin and nearly drowned him. Open Range left him with cracked ribs after a fall that knocked the wind and youth out of him. Years later, during Hidden Figures, kidney stones were so severe he filmed under medication rather than delay production. Pain followed him not because he was reckless, but because he refused to fake what a body should carry. If anger appeared on screen, he once said quietly, it probably came from somewhere real. It always did. Now, the body remembered everything the mind had once outrun. Cold settled deep into his shoulders in Aspen. His back stiffened before dawn. Hands that once steadied, others trembled slightly in mountain wind. Doctors called it deterioration. He chose another word. Evidence. Evidence that he had shown up fully, without reservation. He moved slower, but his movement was deliberate. Purpose sharpened when speed was taken away. Even so, he refused comfort. Crew members on Horizon remarked that he worked harder than men half his age, directing, acting, editing under unforgiving sun. Between takes, he sat alone, eyes fixed on land stretching toward a horizon he still believed in. Youth had left him. Certainty had thinned. But belief remained intact. You cannot fake what lives in a man's eyes, he once said, and is still held light, tired but unbroken. There were days the ache lingered longer than it should. Nights when old injuries surfaced like ghosts, each one carrying a memory attached to it. He did not complain. He folded the pain into the work and let it speak for him. For those watching from afar, older now themselves, waking stiff, tired, slower, there was something quietly sacred in witnessing him still rise, still ride, still choose movement over surrender. He had become a mirror for anyone learning that aging is not about losing strength, but about deciding what strength is for. Late evenings at Dunner Ranch often ended in stillness. Horses grazing beyond the fence. Sky burning gold, then dimming. He stood with hands resting on weathered wood, veins pronounced, lines deep. He breathed slowly, as if storing the light for harder days. Behind him lay a life of storms. Marriages ended, promises broken, years spent running. Ahead lay fewer years, but clearer ones. He knew the body would not last. None do, but stories last. Faith lasts. Grit lasts. I may have slowed, he once said, a faint smile breaking through fatigue, but I haven't stopped. That line carried no bravado. It carried accounting. He had measured what was left and decided it was enough to keep going. The public often reduced him to numbers at this stage. Estimated net worth figures, property valuations, per episode salaries. But those numbers had lost meaning for him. After settlements, risks, and investments that demanded tens of millions of his own dollars, wealth stopped feeling like excess. It began to feel like proof. Proof that he had survived a long, volatile life without disappearing. Horizon was never about trend or timing. It was about land, patience, and the conviction that some stories are worth carrying even when they cost more than they return. His real estate reflected that philosophy. Dunner Ranch was not a showpiece. It was an ecosystem. Acres built for weather and time rather than spectacle. Multiple homes sitting low against the land, designed to endure rather than impress. In California, properties once valued in the tens of millions have been sold, downsized, simplified. These were never trophies. They were places where children learned to swim, where scripts were rewritten at kitchen tables, where absence slowly settled into corners no renovation could erase. Possessions followed the same logic. No obsession with flash. Vehicles chosen for terrain and function. Garages filled with dust, tools, evidence of use. Mornings began early now, stretching careful, deliberate. Chronic pain was managed daily through walking, light strength training, horseback riding. Discipline rooted in listening rather than denial. Age had curved his posture slightly and etched deep lines into his face. What it removed was pretense. He looked exactly like someone who had lived every mile and paid attention along the way. Inside, life had not grown easier. It had grown more precise. He was present for his children in ways that never made headlines. School plays instead of premieres. Long phone calls instead of statements. Quiet weekends that did not trend. Children from different chapters of his life, different homes, different histories. He treated none of it as inconvenience. He treated it as responsibility. That, more than any role or accolade, defined who Kevin Costner had become. Not a man chasing relevance. Not a man protecting an image. But a man learning how to remain accountable when time, applause, and certainty had all begun to thin. In the end, Kevin Costner's story does not resolve in a triumph or defeat. It settles into something quieter and far more uncomfortable. Responsibility without applause. After decades spent outrunning uncertainty, he arrived at a place where nothing chased him anymore except time itself. And time, unlike critics or headlines, cannot be negotiated with. It does not care how many times you rebuild. It only asks what you choose to carry forward. What remains of his life now is narrower than the myth people attach to his name, but it is also truer. The noise has thinned. The rooms are quieter. The victories no longer stack neatly on top of one another. What he has instead is accountability, daily, uncelebrated, and persistent. He shows up for his children not because it redeems the past, but because it answers the present. Co-parenting is not framed as a lesson learned or a public stance. It is lived in calendars, long drives, rearranged schedules, and phone calls returned even when exhaustion argues otherwise. He understands something many never do until it is too late. Love does not end when relationships end. It changes form, and its most demanding form is presence without ownership. Hollywood still circles him occasionally, measuring his relevance, debating his choices, revisiting his risks. But that conversation now happens largely outside him. He no longer corrects narratives or competes with younger versions of himself. The man who once needed momentum to survive learned, slowly and painfully, that momentum is not the same as direction. Direction requires stillness, and stillness is something he had to earn through loss. There is a particular loneliness that comes with aging in public. Your failures are archived. Your successes are fossilized. People speak about you as if your story has already finished, even while you are still living inside it. Costner learned to live with that distortion. He does not chase legacy because he understands something subtle. Legacy is not what people remember about you. It is what people are allowed to rely on you for while you are still here. That is why his later work favors endurance over dominance, patience over conquest. The men he plays are not heroes. They are caretakers of things that cannot be replaced: land, family, memory. His life demonstrates a difficult truth that modern culture resists. Ambition extracts payment whether you consent or not. You can pay with money, you can pay with time, or you can pay with absence. Costner paid with all three. The tragedy is not that he failed to protect what mattered. The tragedy is that he believed for a long time that protecting it meant providing rather than staying. It is a mistake many make, and few survive without regret. Now, When evenings arrive and the light thins across the land he chose to keep, he does not rush to fill the quiet. Horses graze. Wind moves through grass. The body aches. Memory stirs. He stands still long enough to feel all of it without flinching. That may be the most radical shift of his life. Not endurance, not resilience, but permission to stop proving. He understands that no amount of work will give him back the years he missed or the moments that passed without him. But he also understands that the future is shaped by how honestly you carry what remains. He no longer builds for validation. He builds for continuity. Something his children can inherit without explanation. Something that does not need defending. If there is heartbreak here, it is not theatrical. It is cumulative. A life lived at full speed eventually asks for payment in silence. And silence, when you finally stop running from it, does not accuse. It instructs. It tells you what matters when nothing else is speaking. Kevin Costner does not stand at the peak of his life now. He stands beyond it, in a place few reach and even fewer accept. A place where success no longer shields you from loss, and loss no longer excuses you from responsibility. What defines him here is not his filmography or his fortune, but his refusal to disappear inward when life narrowed his options. That is the quiet ending of his story. Not applause, not redemption, not collapse. Just a man still choosing to show up, still choosing to carry what he can, still choosing integrity over escape, even when escape would be easier. And that is why his tragedy feels so close to home, because it is not about fame at all. It is about time, and what it takes from everyone, eventually,